It is 9:40 a.m. in the morning, the first day of November, 1755, All Saints' Day, in every church in Lisbon, and there are more than 40 of them. The candles are lit. The incense is rising. The priests are at the altar. The pews are full, because today, every faithful Catholic in the most devout city in Europe has come to pray for their dead. They do not know that by noon, they will have 40,000 new ones. My name is Ivan, and this is Vinodal Archive, where we reconstruct the moments history forgot to warn us about. What you are about to see took 6 minutes to begin. It took 3 hours to complete, and it took a civilization 2 centuries to fully understand what it meant. This is Lisbon, November 1st, 1755. Let us go back. To understand what was lost on the 1st of November of 1755, you first have to understand what Lisbon was, not what it looked like, what it was. In the middle of the 18th century, Lisbon was one of the wealthiest cities on earth. It sat at the mouth of the Tagus River, facing the Atlantic, and for 200 years, everything that came out of Brazil, out of Africa, out of India, passed through this port first. Gold, diamonds, spices, silk, the entire wealth of a global empire arrived here, was taxed here, was counted here, and then distributed to the rest of Europe. The result was a city of extraordinary beauty. The Baca, the lower city, was a maze of narrow streets lined with 5- and 6-story buildings, their facades decorated with hand-painted azulejo tiles in blue and white. Every building told a story. The tiles on the wealthier houses depicted biblical scenes, hunting parties, mythological figures. On the humbler ones, simple geometric patterns in cobalt and white that caught the morning light and threw it back into the street in fragments. The churches were among the finest in the Catholic world, gilded interiors, paintings by masters, organs that shook the air when they played. The patriarchal cathedral, the SA, had stood since the 12th century, its Romanesque towers visible from the river, from the hills, from the decks of ships arriving after months at sea. The Church of San Domingos, the convent of the Carmo, which sat on a hilltop above the city like a crown. Dozens of others, each one repository of centuries of wealth and devotion, their interiors dense with gold leaf and carved stone, and the accumulated offerings of people who believed, deeply and without irony, that God was watching them from a particular interest. The royal palace occupied the entire eastern waterfront, a complex of buildings so large it took 20 minutes to walk from one end to the other. The king's library alone held 70,000 volumes, one of the largest private collections in Europe. There were tapestries from Flanders, clocks from England, porcelain from China, scientific instruments from the finest workshops in France. The palace was not just a residence, it was a statement. It said, "We have been to the ends of the earth and brought back everything worth keeping." And then there was the Tagus itself. From the waterfront, the river was almost impossibly wide, nearly 3 kilometers across at its mouth. On clear mornings, the light on the water turned everything gold. Fishermen set out before dawn, their boats small and dark against the brightness. Merchant ships from Brazil arrived with the tide, riding low in the water under the weight of their cargoes. The smell of salt and spice and timber was everywhere, the particular smell of a city that has one foot always in the ocean. The waterfront market opened before sunrise. By 7 in the morning it was already full, fishwives with their baskets of sardines and cod, spice merchants with their small pyramids of saffron and pepper and cinnamon, cloth sellers with bolts of fabric from India and Brazil, bakers, knife grinders, water carriers, moving through the crowd with their great ceramic jars. The noise was enormous. The smell was overwhelming. The energy was the energy of a city that had no reason to believe it was anything other than permanent. This was Lisbon, a city of 200 people. The 4th largest city in Europe, richer than Vienna, more confident than Madrid, and on the morning of November 1st, 1755, entirely unaware that it was about to cease to exist. Father Gabriel MELO had been a priest at the Church of San Roque for 11 years. He was not a dramatic man. He was precise, methodical. The kind of priest who arrived at the altar 10 minutes early and checked that every candle was the same height. He had a small, careful handwriting and kept a diary, not out of vanity, but because he believed that an examined life left better traces. On the morning of the 1st of November 1st, he rose at 5. He dressed in the dark. He walked the 300 meters from the rectory to the church in silence, listening to the city wake up around him, the cartwheels on cobblestones, the first vendors setting up their stalls, a dog barking somewhere near the river. The air was cool and clear and smelled of the sea. It was a beautiful morning. He noted this in his diary later. He remembered thinking it was a beautiful morning. By 7:30, the church was nearly full. San Roque was not the grandest church in Lisbon, but it was one of the finest interiors in the city. The Jesuits had filled it over 2 centuries with extraordinary chapels, each one a small masterpiece of marble and mosaic and gilded bronze. On All Saints' Day, it was always packed. People stood in the aisles. The candles, hundreds of them, turned the air warm and golden. He began the Mass at 8. At 9:40 a.m., he was at the altar, his back to the congregation, his hands raised for the Gloria. He would later write, in the diary they found under 3 meters of rubble, that he heard it before he felt it. A sound like the earth clearing its throat, he wrote, as if something enormous and very deep and very old had decided to speak, and then the floor moved. The earthquake began offshore. Scientists who have studied the 1755 event placed the epicenter roughly 200 kilometers southwest of Lisbon, in the Atlantic, in a deep fault zone where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates meet. The energy released is estimated at between magnitude 8.5 and 9.0 on the modern Richter scale. To put that in context, it is one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded European history. In terms of raw energy, it released more force than every nuclear weapon ever detonated on Earth, combined. The first tremors reached Lisbon at 9:40 a.m. They lasted between 3.5 and 6 minutes, depending on which survivor account you trust. In those minutes, the city did not shake, it convulsed. Buildings that had stood for 200 years dropped in 30 seconds. Church towers, some of them 40 meters tall, swayed once, twice, and then came down in avalanches of stone that crushed the streets below. The ground itself opened in places, long cracks appearing in the hillsides, swallowing people who were running, swallowing streets, swallowing the foundations of buildings that had seemed solid an hour before. The noise was beyond description. Every survivor who tried to write it down eventually gave up and said something like, "There are no words for a sound that large." One British merchant who was in the city on business wrote that it sounded like the end of the world, and then immediately crossed that out and wrote, "No, it sounded like the beginning of the end of the world, because it went on for so long, and when it stopped, it was not over." Inside the church of San Roque, Father Gabriel MELO had exactly enough time to turn from the altar and face his congregation before the roof began to move. "I saw their faces," he wrote later, "and I understood that I was looking at people who were, in that moment, choosing whether to run or to pray. Most of them chose to run. I cannot say they were wrong. The roof of San Roque held. It was one of the few that did. Built low and wide by Jesuit engineers who had designed it with earthquakes in mind. They had seen what happened in other parts of the empire, in Brazil, in Goa. It distributed the force sideways instead of collapsing inward. The walls cracked. Plaster fell in sheets. Several of the side chapels were destroyed, but the main structure held. Father MELO survived. He crawled out through a side door into a street that no longer resembled a street. Across the city, the picture was catastrophic. The Baixa, the most densely built district, home to the most people, had essentially ceased to exist. The narrow streets had become corridors of falling stone. 5- and 6-story buildings had pancaked straight down, each floor collapsing onto the one below, the weight multiplying with every story, until the street was filled to the rooftops with rubble. Anyone who had been inside a building when the shaking began was now either dead, trapped, or running through a city that had become unrecognizable in 4 minutes. The hospitals were destroyed. The jails were destroyed. The records buildings, where the Portuguese kept the documentation of their empire, centuries of trade records, land grants, maritime logs, census data, were destroyed. The patriarchal cathedral, which had stood since the 12th century, lost its towers and half its nave. The archbishop's palace, adjacent to the cathedral, was completely flattened. Those who survived the buildings ran toward the water. This is what people do in disasters. They run toward open space. And in Lisbon, in 1755, the largest open space was the waterfront, the great Terreiro do Paço Square, which faced the river, which was wide and calm and unobstructed, and seemed from a distance like safety. Tens of thousands of people ran there, and that is where the second catastrophe found them. Teresa Diaz had run with her 2 children from their house in the Alfama district, pulling them by the hand through streets choked with fallen stone, past people who were not moving, past a horse that was screaming, past a church whose entire front facade had slid into the road like a curtain bee. Pulled down. The Alfama, the old Moorish district on the hillside above the river, had fared better than the Baixa, because its buildings were older and lower, and built differently, and because the hillside itself had absorbed some of the shock. But better than the Baixa was not good. Dozens of buildings had collapsed. The streets were full of dust so thick you could not see more than 10 meters ahead. Teresa had grabbed her children, Maria, 7, and Antonio, 9, and run without stopping to take anything, without stopping to check on the neighbors, without doing anything except getting her children out of the building before it fell. It did fall, she learned later, the back half of it, where the kitchen was, where she had been standing 20 minutes before the earthquake. She reached the Terreiro do Paço and stopped. Around her, thousands of others had done the same thing. The square was enormous, one of the largest public spaces in Europe, and it was filling up fast. People were crying, people were praying, people were calling out names. A man near Teresa was sitting on the ground, holding his arm at an angle that meant it was broken. A woman was carrying a child who was not moving. A priest was kneeling in the center of the square with his hands raised, praying at the top of his voice. And then Teresa noticed something. The river was going wrong. The water was pulling back, she would later tell a notary, who was collecting survivor testimony, like a tide, but faster, and much further. I could see the riverbed, stones and mud that I had never seen before, and it smelled strange, like the deep sea, like something that was not meant to be in the air. The survivors on the waterfront watched the Tagus pull back 200 meters, 300 meters, exposing the ancient mudflats and the wrecks of old ships and things that had not seen the light in generations. Fish were stranded on the exposed riverbed, flapping in the mud. The harbor walls, which normally stood in several meters of water, were suddenly standing in air. Some of them ran. Most of them stood and stared. Teresa grabbed her children and ran. She was in the second street back from the waterfront when the first wave came. The tsunami generated by the 1755 earthquake sent 3 major waves into the Tagus estuary. The first arrived approximately 40 minutes after the initial tremors. It was between 6 and 20 meters high, accounts vary considerably, and it moved at the speed of a galloping horse. On the open Atlantic coast south of Lisbon, in the fishing villages of the Algarve, it was even more devastating. Entire villages simply vanished, swept from coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years. In Lisbon, it hit the waterfront like a wall. The Terreiro do Paço, which moments before had been crowded with tens of thousands of survivors, was swept completely clean. The water moved so fast that most people had no time to react. It came over the harbor walls, across the square, and into the first streets of the city in seconds. The ships in the harbor, those that had survived the earthquake, were picked up and thrown inland. Some of them carried 2 and 3 streets back from the waterfront before they came to rest against the rubble of collapsed buildings. The water did not recede gently. It pushed through the lower city in churning brown walls, carrying with it everything the earthquake had knocked down: stone blocks, timber beams, furniture, boats, animals, people. It went 3, 4, 5 streets back from the waterfront before it finally lost momentum, and then it pulled back out, pulling everything with it, and the second wave came. and then the third. Teresa Diaz survived because she ran. She lost her older child, a boy of 9 named Antonio, in the wave. She had been holding his hand. She felt it pulled from hers in the water, in the dark, and the noise and the cold, and then he was gone. She spent 3 days searching the rubble before she accepted that she would not find him. She found a notary on the 4th day and made him write it down. She said she wanted someone to know that his name had been Antonio Diaz, that he had been 9 years old, and that he had not been afraid of the earthquake. He held my hand very tightly, she told the notary, but he did not cry. If the earthquake was the sentence and the tsunami was the full stop, then the fire was the footnote that burned for 6 days. Here is the cruel arithmetic of All Saints' Day, 1755. Every church in Lisbon had been full of candles that morning, hundreds of candles per church, 40 churches across the city. Every one of them was knocked over by the earthquake, and most of them landed on wood, pews, floors, timber roof supports, the embroidered fabric of altars and tapestries that had been accumulating in these buildings for 2 centuries. The fire started within minutes of the first tremors. Under normal circumstances, Lisbon had a system for dealing with fires. Not a good one by modern standards, but functional, men with buckets, access to wells, narrow streets that could sometimes contain a blaze. But on November 1st, 1755, every well in the lower city had been contaminated or destroyed by the earthquake. The narrow streets had been blocked by rubble. The fire brigades had no routes through the city, and the winds that came in off the Atlantic that morning were blowing hard and steady from the west, directly into the heart of the city. The fires joined together. By afternoon, what had been dozens of separate blazes had merged into something that survivors described as a wall of flame. It moved east through what remained of the Baixia, consuming building after building, jumping streets on gusts of wind, feeding on the oil and timber and cloth that the most prosperous city in the Western world had spent 2 centuries accumulating. The fire was so large it could be seen from ships at sea, 70 kilometers away. The smoke was so dense it blocked out the sun. People who had survived the earthquake and the tsunami now found themselves trapped between rubble they could not climb and fire they could not outrun. It burned for 6 days. When it was over, the lower city, the Baixia, the Chiado, the area around the royal palace, was a field of ash and blackened stone. Estimates suggest that 70,000 buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Of the great churches, almost nothing remained standing. The church of San Domingos, gutted, its interior destroyed, only the walls left. The Carmelite convent, the roof collapsed entirely, and a nave left open to the sky, which is how it remains to this day, preserved as a memorial. The Royal Library, gone. 70,000 books, maps, manuscripts, the accumulated knowledge of a maritime empire, including irreplaceable records of Portuguese discoveries and voyages going back to the 15th century, reduced to ash in 3 days. The royal palace itself was partially destroyed. The art collection, including works by Rubens and Titian, was lost. The state archives were lost. Centuries of government records, property deeds, tax records, census data, the documentation of an entire empire, burned or soaked or buried under stone. While Lisbon burned, the king was in Belém. King Joseph I of Portugal had left the city the previous evening for a brief stay at the royal estate outside the city walls, a routine visit that had nothing significant about it. It was this accident of timing that saved his life, and arguably saved Portugal. When the earthquake struck, the king's first instinct was paralysis. He was, by most historical accounts, not a man built for crisis. He was musical, cultured, deeply religious, and entirely unsuited to the task of managing the worst natural disaster in European history. In the hours after the earthquake, as reports began arriving at Belém of the scale of the destruction, the king is said to have wept. He asked the archbishop what God wanted. He asked his confessor whether he should pray or act. He did neither effectively, but he had a minister, the Marquis of POMBAL, Sebastián José de Carvalho y MELO, was 56 years old. On a 1755, he was not a warm man. He was not a patient man. He had reputation for ruthlessness, and his enemies called cruelty, and his allies called efficiency. He had spent years as Portuguese ambassador in London and Vienna, watching how modern states were organized, how bureaucracies functioned, how governments managed crises, and he had come back to Lisbon with a clear-eyed contempt for disorder in all its forms. On the morning of the 1st of November, while the king sat in shock at Belém, the Marquis Pombal got on a horse. He rode into the ruins of the city. He saw what there was to see: the collapsed streets, the fires beginning, the tens of thousands of survivors with no shelter, and no food and no one in charge. He rode back out. And then he did something that no government official in European history had quite done before. In the aftermath of a natural disaster, he made a list. The list had 3 items on it: bury the dead, feed the living, rebuild the city, in that order, with that precision, starting immediately. When the king asked him, in a voice apparently close to tears, what they should do, Pombal's answer was the same: bury the dead, feed the living, rebuild the city. The Marquis moved with terrifying speed. Within hours of returning from the city, he had issued orders mobilizing the military to clear the main streets. Bodies were to be removed and buried outside the city walls. The risk of epidemic from tens of thousands of unburied dead in the summer heat was immediate and real. Within days, he had established a system of food distribution using the military and the church together, commandeering supplies from warehouses that had survived the disaster. He set fixed prices for food and building materials to prevent the profiteering that would otherwise have made recovery impossible. Within weeks, he had passed legislation making it illegal to leave Lisbon. He was worried that if people fled, they would never come back, and the city would die not from the earthquake, but from abandonment. He was probably right. Other cities, destroyed by disasters or wars throughout European history, had died exactly that way. And then he did something that no one in 1755 had any right to expect. He hired engineers. Real ones, military engineers who understood soil mechanics and load distribution and drainage. He had them survey every street in the ruined city, mapping what had fallen and what had not, what the ground was doing underneath, where water ran and where it pooled. He commissioned geological surveys of the kind that barely existed, yet as a formal discipline. And from that survey, he commissioned an entirely new Lisbon, not a restoration of what had been, but a replacement. A rational, modern, grid-planned city with wider streets, standardized building heights, earthquake-resistant construction methods that were, in many cases, 300 years ahead of their time. The engineers developed what became known as the POMBAL cage, a timber frame built into the walls of every new building, designed to flex rather than collapse under seismic stress. They tested it by marching soldiers around scale models to simulate the ground movement of an earthquake. The new Baisa, the POMBAL Baisa, as historians now call it, was built on a grid so precise, so mathematically ordered, that its streets are perfectly parallel and perfectly perpendicular, its blocks identical in dimension, its facades regulated by law, to ensure that no building is too tall to fall on another without destroying it. It is still there. You can walk it today. And if you know what you are looking for, you can see, in the geometry of those streets, the mind of a man who looked at the worst disaster in European history and decided that the correct response was not grief, but arithmetic. The king, when he saw the plans, reportedly asked Pombal what they should do with the ruins of the old city. Pombal's answer has become one of the most quoted lines in Portuguese history: bury the dead, feed the living, rebuild the city. The king asked if they should rebuild the churches first. Pombal said no, they would rebuild the streets first. The churches could wait. The people could not. Here is something that the earthquake destroyed, that you cannot see in any photograph of the ruins. It destroyed an idea. For most of European history, and certainly for the deeply Catholic culture of 18th century Portugal, natural disasters had a clear theological meaning. They were acts of God, not random, not mechanical, but intentional, purposeful. A city destroyed by an earthquake had been destroyed because God had willed it. The people who died had died because God had allowed it. The correct response was prayer, penance, and submission to divine judgment. This was not an eccentric position. It was mainstream. It was what educated, reasonable people believed. This was the official position of the Catholic Church in Lisbon on November 2nd, 1755, the day after the earthquake. The earthquake was God's punishment for the sins of the city. The Jesuits said so from what pulpits remained standing. The Inquisition agreed. The solution was repentance. The Inquisition actually conducted trials in the months following the earthquake, prosecuting people accused of sins they claimed had brought the disaster down. In one notorious case, a priest named Gabriel Malagreda, no relation to our father MELO, published a pamphlet arguing that the earthquake was direct divine punishment for the immorality of Lisbon's people, and that rebuilding the city before its inhabitants had repented was an act of defiance against God. The Marquis of POMBAL had Malagreda arrested, eventually executed, and then expelled the entire Jesuit order from Portugal. But it was not in Portugal that the philosophical consequences were most dramatically felt. It was in the salons and coffee houses and university lecture halls of Paris, of London, of Berlin, of Geneva, the centers of what we now call the Enlightenment, that the earthquake arrived like a stone thrown into a still pond, and the ripples went on for decades. The dominant philosophical position in educated European circles in 1755 came largely from Leibniz, the German mathematician and philosopher, who had argued 40 years earlier that God, being omnipotent and perfectly good, must necessarily have created the best of all possible worlds. This was not naive optimism. It was a serious philosophical argument, carefully constructed. It meant that suffering existed in the world for reasons we might not understand, but that were, in the final accounting, part of an order that was rational and good. Voltaire had never entirely believed this, but after Lisbon, he stopped being polite about it. Within months of the earthquake, he published his poem on the Lisbon disaster, a direct, furious attack on the Leibnizian position. If we live in the best of all possible worlds, Voltaire wrote, then what does that mean for the 40,000 people who died in Lisbon while they were at prayer on a holy day? Were their deaths the best possible outcome? Was the destruction of the finest library in the Iberian Peninsula, the loss of centuries of irreplaceable knowledge, part of God's optimal plan? He did not soften the questions. He was not looking for answers. He was trying to make the questions unanswerable, because he believed that was what they were. 4 years later, he published Candide, one of the most read books of the 18th century, in which the earthquake appears directly, in the middle of the novel, as the event that finally, irreversibly breaks the optimist's faith. Candide had his mentor Pangloss, who has been insisting throughout the book that everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, arrive in Lisbon on the day of the earthquake. They watch the city collapse. They survive. Pangloss begins to explain to a survivor that the earthquake must be for the best, and the survivor is so outraged that he helps have Pangloss arrested by the Inquisition. It is a comedy. But it is a comedy with a cold center. Lisbon did not just kill 40,000 people, it killed a philosophy. The idea that the universe was rationally ordered, that suffering had meaning, that God's plan was legible in the events of the world. This idea did not survive the 18th century intact. And the single event that did more damage to it than any other was a 6-minute earthquake on All Saints' Day in a city full of people who were praying when the ground opened beneath them. The Enlightenment, the age of reason, of science, of secular governance, was not caused by the Lisbon earthquake, but it was accelerated by it. The earthquake gave philosophers and scientists and reformers a concrete, undeniable, horrifying example of what happens when you rely on prayer instead of planning, on theology instead of engineering, on divine providence instead of rational governance. Pombal's response to the earthquake, empirical, administrative, ruthlessly practical, was itself a kind of Enlightenment program made visible in stone and street grids. He did not ask God why it had happened. He hired engineers and made a list. That is not a metaphor. That is history. Father Gabriel MELO spent the 3 months following the earthquake living in a tent in what had been the square outside his church. He organized food distribution for his district, working with the military and with other clergy to ensure that the people who had not fled, and there were thousands of them, camped in the hills and open spaces outside the city, in tents and improvised shelters, and under the open sky, something to eat and somewhere to sleep that was not a ruin. He buried the dead when there were enough people to help him carry them. He administered last rites to people who were dying of injuries and exposure and shock in the weeks after the earthquake, kneeling in the mud beside makeshift beds in the open air. He wrote in his diary every night, in careful, small handwriting, by candlelight, because he believed that someone should record what had happened, precisely and without embellishment, while the details were still clear. He noted the names of the dead he buried, the ages of children, the addresses of buildings that no longer existed, the things people said to him in their last hours. He wrote it all down in his small, careful hand, and he kept the diary in a wooden box that he carried everywhere, because he was afraid that if he left it anywhere, even for a night, it would be lost. He died in 1761, 6 years after the earthquake, of a fever. He was 50 years old. His diary was found in the archives of the Lisbon Patriarchate in 1923, in a collection of documents that no one had catalogued properly. It was published in a small scholarly edition that almost no one read. We are reading it now. TERESA Diaz remarried in 1758. She had 2 more children, both daughters, both of whom she outlived. She moved to the new Baika when it was completed, to one of the POMBAL buildings with the regulated facades and the earthquake-resistant foundations, her apartment on the 2nd floor of a building on a street that had not existed before 1755, that had been designed by engineers who were thinking about load distribution and drainage when the old street that had been there before was already a memory. She lived in that apartment until 1779, when she died at the age of 55. She never spoke publicly about Antonio again, after the testimony she gave to the notary in November 1755. But the notary's document survives, in the same archive as Father MELO's diary, catalogued under a reference number that means nothing to anyone who does not know what they are looking for. Antonio Diaz, 9 years old, did not cry. The Marquis of POMBAL governed Portugal for 22 more years after the earthquake, becoming increasingly powerful and increasingly ruthless, until the king died in 1777, and the new queen, who hated him and feared him and blamed him for the execution of Malagrida and others, dismissed him. Almost immediately, he was investigated, accused of crimes, ultimately not prosecuted, partly because he was 80 years old and dying, partly because even his enemies acknowledged that without him, there would have been no reconstruction. He died in 1782. 83 years old, hated by his enemies and respected, somewhat reluctantly, by almost everyone else. The new Baxa that he built still stands. It survived the 20th century and 2 world wars that Portugal largely sat out. It survived the revolution of 1904. It survived the European financial crisis, which hit Portugal particularly hard, and the decade of austerity that followed. It is now, somewhat ironically, one of the most photographed districts in Europe. Tourists from 40 countries walk its perfect grid every day, eating pastéis de nata at outdoor tables, photographing the azulejos tiles on the buildings, without knowing that every precisely parallel street is a monument to a minister who decided that grief was not a building material. And the Carmelite convent still stands roofless on its hilltop, its Gothic arches open to the Lisbon sky, exactly as the earthquake and the fire left them in November 1755. The Portuguese made a decision after the earthquake not to rebuild the Carmelite convent, not because they could not. There was money, eventually, to rebuild almost everything else, but because someone decided, at some point in the years after the disaster, that this particular ruin should be left as it was, that it should be allowed to stand open to the sky, to the rain, to the seasons, as a record of what had happened. Every time it rains in Lisbon, it rains into the Carmelite nave. Every time the sun sets over the city, The light comes through those arches and falls across the stone floor, the way it has fallen for 270 years. There is a museum inside now, archaeological, quiet. You can walk through the Gothic columns and look up at the open sky, where the roof used to be. The birds nest in the arches. In spring, weeds grow from the cracks between the stones. The city goes on all around it. Trams on the streets below, tourists on the viewpoints above. The smell of coffee and grilled fish and diesel and the sea. It is the most honest monument I know. Not a statue of a hero standing triumphant on a plinth, not a plaque with a list of dates. Just a building that was broken, left broken, and made into a place where you can stand inside the evidence of what happened and feel the weight of it on a perfectly ordinary afternoon. 40,000 people died in Lisbon on the first 1755. They died in the churches they had come to pray in. They died on the waterfront they had run to for safety. They died in the streets they had lived in their whole lives, under buildings that had stood for 200 years and came down in 30 seconds. They died in the water. They died in the fire. They died in the days and weeks that followed, of injuries and exposure, and the particular kind of despair that comes from losing everything you had and everyone you loved in a single morning. The city they built in the years that followed, the POMBAL Baisa, with its rational streets and earthquake-resistant walls and regulated facades, is still there. It is beautiful, in the precise and slightly austere way that rational things sometimes are. But here is the thing I cannot stop thinking about. The earthquake lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes is how long it takes to make a cup of coffee, to walk 3 blocks, to read a child a bedtime story. 6 minutes is the length of a short piece of music, the time between 2 bus stops, the duration of a conversation that changes your life. 6 minutes is nothing. And Lisbon, the Lisbon that had taken 2 centuries of empire, 2 centuries of gold and spice and azaleo tile and prayer, an accumulated human effort to build, was gone before the 7-minute mark. We think of history as something that happens slowly, empires rising and falling over centuries, ideas spreading across generations, cities growing block by block over lifetimes. And mostly it is slow. Mostly history is patient. But sometimes it is not. Sometimes 6 minutes is all it takes. History does not warn us before it happens. It only lets us reconstruct it afterward and hope that we are paying attention. This was Vinodal Archive. If this story moved you, subscribe. The next one is waiting.